Thank you all so much for joining us for the Indigenous Old World, an exploration of pre-Columbian North America. So we're going to explore the worlds of the indigenous peoples of North America before European colonization. North America was a place filled with cities, towns, and villages. Across the continent, indigenous people produced architecture and monumental construction. The ancient and medieval communities of North America were fed by agriculture. And moreover, Indigenous Americans actively managed their environment and participated in long-distance exchange networks. And we're going to learn all about this tonight from Christoph Strobel, who's the department chair and professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Christoph is the author of War and Colonization in the early American Northeast, as well as Native Americans of New England and the global Atlantic 1400 to 1900. And he has also published many other books and academic papers. All right. So all nearly 250 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Christoph for joining us here today. And Christoph, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much, Robert, for having me. And thank you so much for everyone to come out from not only all over Massachusetts, but many other corners of New England and really from all over the United States. It's quite humbling. And let's not forget our neighbors to the north in the beautiful city of Montreal. Last time I talked at the Tewksbury Library, that was actually based on a talk that I had done on the talk was based on a book I had written. Today's talk is really kind of based on sort of years of teaching, and it's really almost 3 decades of teaching Native American Indigenous history, and sort of the importance that I have increasingly seen in sort of the pre-colonial history and sort of how our understanding of the pre-Columbian, the pre-colonial history has really been skewed and really kind of gives us a wrong understanding about not only North America, but really all of the Americas. But I'm going to keep my talk to North America. And what I'm going to do is I'm not even going to talk about all the highlights, big sites, big important sites of archaeology. But what I rather will do is talk about some of the smaller and some of them rather unimportant, quote unquote, unimportant sites that I think are really fascinating and really underscoring some of the very important themes of pre-1500, pre-1490 to Indigenous history. So I am not an Indigenous person. In fact, I grew up in Europe, and I grew up at the bottom of sort of my hometown was built around a hill that had this fortress or castle on it. And I spent much of my childhood playing in this medieval fortress with friends, hide and seek, and all the other stuff we played. And I was always fascinated with old things, but I was equally fascinated how in a place like Europe or places in the Middle East and Asia I traveled, this old medieval history and these old buildings are very much relished. And I'm realizing I'm having the sun shine right into
No worries, Christoph. We've all been there before.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna stop at my facilities. Maybe if I turn a little bit this way, it's a little bit. No, it doesn't make a difference. Anyway, so we're just gonna leave it at it. You'll just have my solar glare in my face, which probably doesn't help or hurt anymore. So anyway, growing up and then coming to the United States as an immigrant, I was always fascinated by the old history and how I talk to Americans and how they have been to all these important European sites, but many of them haven't been to some of these very outstanding and fascinating sites that are that can be seen in the United States. And often they are not in restored castles or old cities, but rather they're in ruins or very much fragmented. And that's very much the sort of the launching point for my talk today, that I want to sort of think about and maybe explore with you guys. Why are we not talking more about this history, and why is this in many ways a forgotten history? I should also say that the Indigenous Old World is kind of me plagiarizing, and because I'm saying it now, it's not plagiarizing it, but it's actually meant as sort of a compliment for my academic advisor, Neil Salisbury, who chaired my PhD dissertation. And he wrote an article called The Indians' Old World, and sort of as a compliment to him and this particular article, I'm drawing this presentation title for that. I want to start out with a famous statue, and I'm just picking James Earl Fraser as the end of the trail statue. I could have picked many others. I mean, we have one similar statue right outside of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts that's been in the media lately, just in Massachusetts, but they can be found all over the country. But I also think these statues are important because they often depict sort of a Great Plains warrior on top of a horse. And when we think about the indigenous population of the United States, often the images that come to mind to modern Americans, but also to someone that grew up in Europe, were always the Great Plains Indian. And so the Great Plains Indian has become sort of that powerful archetype of what a real quote unquote Native American needs to look or should look like. But I look at this picture and I'm like, as a historian, I'm very fascinated because this picture is all about change. So actually, if you would have had a Great Plains Indian at the end of the 19th century, defeated in the quote unquote last battle, he would have not had a spear, but more likely a gun in his hand. But the other thing that's fascinating to me is the horse on which the Native American sits. And that, in a sense, is also part of colonization, because it's Europeans and more specifically, the Spanish in the Southwest that bring horses to the United States, and then Native American, then these horses spreading like wildfire all over the Great Plains, and then Native Americans very quickly adapting the horse, and in many ways revolutionizing their lifeways on the Great Plains around the horse. More on that later, but this picture to me is all about colonization. And I'm gonna just put a cartoon here that I think exemplifies in many ways how many Americans felt at the turn of the 20th century, so late 19th century and early 20th century, about Native Americans. And it's this incredibly racialized attitude about Native Americans, sort of the quote unquote savage tropes and the wild men, quote unquote. I'm currently working on a book project that explores this in New English culture, from like the first colonists to the 18th century, the Mathers, into the 19th century, great American writers like Thoreau, Whittier, and closing the arc into the 20th century, that have all had very interesting construction and stereotypical perceptions and representations of Native Americans in their work. And we really, in US culture, from colonial times to the present, have kind of these very strange depictions and dehumanized depictions of Native Americans that have carried on and have become part of our intellectual baggage. And I'm addressing these questions and sort of like sentiments of Christian superiority, cultural chauvinism, racism, because you dispossess indigenous people, right? There's also a history of enslavement of indigenous people in New England and across the United States. And they have become very powerful in the way how we as a mainstream society see Native Americans. And I'm not like, oh, yeah, trying to sort of get everyone to like, you got to see this reality. But I'm just, as I always explain to my students, it's very powerful cultural guiding posts that have been given to us. And you didn't even have to grow up in the United States to sort of have these perceptions handed down from generations and repackaged from generation to generations. And I do this as sort of an effort to kind of explain how powerful and all-pervasive these attitudes are. And that's why I volunteer my time for these kinds of things to sort of help us to change our understanding and really kind of get people to see that there's some cool stuff out there. And for the folks in Phoenix, Arizona, some of them, and for the folks in Illinois and Cincinnati, Ohio, some of these are in very close driving distance to where you live. And for the folks out in New England, time for the Great American Road Trip. All right, so as Robert said at the outset, and again, thank you to Robert and the Tewksbury Library for hosting this. Thank you for all the other libraries for joining into this program. And thank you out there on your computer screens for coming here and getting bored for about an hour by my meanderings. So I want to emphasize again that what we're looking at in North America is a place filled with cities, towns, and villages. It's a continent that is very much dominated by agriculture, and that we have architecture and monumental construction being produced around North America. And that indigenous people in many parts of North America actively manage their environment. And they also participated in long distance exchange networks. So this is kind of the overarching theme that connects many of these places that we're going to talk about today and brings this all together. So what am I talking about here specifically when I talk about long distance exchange and cultural connections across North America? And this really also ties into Mesoamerica. So first, let's start out with agriculture. Maize, or corn, as it's often colloquially referred to in American culture, is a big component, and it's a crop that spreads all over North America. And so that is one of these unifying themes that exists here. Another thing that many of the places I will talk about in the talk, but many of these places all over North America have in common too, is that there is luxury items that are distributed far and wide. So there is particularly like valuable metals, for example, that are then turned into artwork, stones, et cetera, alligator teeth, shark teeth, that are really distributed all over North America. There also seems to be a fascination among Native Americans with certain ball games and the construction of ball courts. And there is a lot of similarities between the ball games. Some archaeologists even argue that it's matter of factly pretty much almost the same game that's being played. So there's a lot of connections of sports as just another one of those connections. The construction of monumental architecture, in many places coming in the form of pyramid or mount architecture, right? So you have pyramids, mound in the Midwest, reaching all the way down into Central America, right? Some archaeologists have argued that these pyramids or mounds are being built as like a replica of the volcano. I'm not going to get into these theories. That's the domain of archaeologists. But as a historian, I care about these long themes and what can this pre-colonial history teach us about about Native Americans and how can we learn more about them. So the Mount architecture and any type of architecture, really. But you also have similar cultural depictions. So the images of gods that you find similarities to in like places in the Midwest, going again all the way down to potentially Mesoamerica. Whether you're in Illinois at the Cahokia site, you have these poles, and they also exist in many other parts of North America where indigenous people have pole hanging rituals. And so again, this is a cultural practice that we see in many parts of North America, similar to sweat lodges, right? And so that is another practice that is practiced among, or that is being used by people all over North America. Another interesting phenomenon, whether you talk about the Puebloan ancestral people, or again, all the way up in the Midwest, is these wood fire ovens that have some similarities in the terms of the technology, how they're being used, that you find in many parts of North America. And the other interesting element of a lot of the sites we're going to be talking about today, and the sites we also won't be talking about, is the astronomical importance that some of these sites seem to have. So why does this history matter? Again, sort of to reiterate, there's urban landscapes in North America. There is agriculture, and they don't necessarily, the colonists writing in the 17th century don't write about these things, right? There is landscape management, whether we have forest efficiency, burnings in the eastern woodlands, or on the West Coast, and other ways that indigenous people actively try to shape their landscape to increase their animal population. Again, these are societies that don't have, well, there's the dog, right? But there is not many domesticatable animals or domestic animals around. So indigenous people, in order to get protein, they need to figure out ways to hunt or obtain or fish for fish. And hunting in many ways is very actively managed, just like I'm just about a couple of 100 yards away from the Pawtucket Falls right there. And like in pre-Columbian times, there would be scaffolding around waterfalls in New England and many other places where Native Americans would very efficiently pull out salmon and other fish in spawning season. So it's a very complicated and sophisticated way that we today call hunting, right? Without really appreciating how much thought there goes into these kinds of ways of life. And then, of course, again, saying it again, long distance exchange networks. What can this history teach us? Can teach us about sustainability, and I'll talk about it more. I can teach about science, and it can also teach us about alternative forms of and the diversity of political and social organization. This is why this history, in my opinion, is very important. All right, so I want to start out again with this image of the Great Plains Indian as sort of a launching point. And again, we have sort of this image of the buffalo hunter. But again, the horse very much only arrives in the 17th and 18th century. Most people on the Great Plains live in the river valleys, and they farm. And they live in these earth lodges, which incidentally now more and more people on the Great Plains start to building houses underground, grass roofs, because we're learning that these ways of architecture are much more energy efficient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And many of the later Great Plains Indian actually abandon agriculture, either on the Great Plains, or they're people migrating out from places like Minnesota, and they're adopting the horse hunting life way because they realize in the 17th and 18th century that this becomes a very efficient way of surviving. And when you look at health statistics, sort of size of people, bone structure, health indicators. 17th and 18th century people on the Great Plains are one of the healthiest population on the planet. So it made sense to abandon agricultural ways that we see here. But I want to go back to the days before the horse and look at especially at groups that are often referred to as the mound builders, quote unquote, and also at Puebloan ancestral population in the Southwest for the rest of today, just to sort of give us a focused perspective here. And you look at some of the major sites on this map here, from the Mississippi culture, Adena, and Hopewell culture. And you can see really how far spread these sites were. On the left-hand side, as you look on the screen, you have a depiction of the Serpent Mound, which is very close to Cincinnati. And so this is a very interesting, what they call an effigy mound. It's my understanding that archaeologists argue there used to be 48 of them, and this is one of the few in the Midwest, and this is one of the few surviving, potentially even the only surviving, at least in the Midwest. Again, building a serpent that is almost 1,350 feet long, carrying all this dirt up there to build this effigy. But then there's also complex mounds on the side of the serpent. Now, it's also of astronomical importance, we believe. The mouth faces to the high point of the sun in the summer, and then the tail to the solstice in the winter, the summer and winter solstice. When you follow the serpent body and when you walk around the serpent mound, there is also breaks within the mounds, and those mark certain lunar cycles. So it's a very interesting architectural piece that demonstrates not only like high degrees of engineering, but also scientific understandings of the movement of the sun and of the lunar cycles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and speak to like a high organization that people just decide to build effigies like this. Another interesting Ohio site, this one is from the Hopewell period, is the Hopewell Mound Group. This is very close to Chillicothe in Ohio, and Chillicothe is the Shawnee word for village. And so we can see that Chillicothe, Ohio, one of the first settlements. Marietta, Ohio, same thing. Is Marietta, Ohio, and the cemetery of Marietta, Ohio is right built out of a Fort Ancient Mount. No, it's not, sorry, not Fort Ancient, Adena Mount. And so Indigenous people knew where the best settlement places were and moved right on top of those in the process of colonization. Same, I'm right here in Lowell, which is right on the side of the old Pawtucket settlement. Patuxet, Plymouth used to be, there used to be an indigenous settlement there too. The Pilgrims, so-called, moved right onto the site. So, but make a long story short, this is sort of when you go to the park side, it's about the size of a college campus, right? But what archaeologists in the last 30 years have found out is that, in fact, there is mounds further and further out, and that this is a complex that really encapsulates several miles of areas. And in fact, I was there a few years ago visiting an archaeologist friend of mine who is no longer at that park, but was at the time. And we were at an excavation. He was like looking out on a farm field and like, you see this mound over there? 20 years ago, we would have said, that's just a natural thing. Now we're not so sure anymore. And interesting there, because I was spending so much time on the ovens, and if you go into Pueblo reconstruction and like the petroglyph park, for example, in New Mexico, you have these ovens, and he was working on a site where they were just trying, like working on a site that they called the pizza oven site. I mean, jokingly to themselves, and so stuff we see in the Southwest reappears in the Midwest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, suggesting that there were connections between indigenous peoples that included networks that often exchange things over thousands of miles. And they include things like the mica hand here that you see, which is from the site and is made out of mica from North Carolina. But when goods are exchanged, chances are that people also exchange ideas and symbolisms and images of God. And so archaeologists increasingly wonder and are exploring more and more of these connections. And there's very interesting work being done by archaeologists in this area. What are some other things that you find at Mound City? There's a copper bird. The copper is probably from Canada. Silver from Wyoming. Shark and alligator teeth, none of them in Ohio. So those are all from the Gulf Coast, right? And so again, we can see how a small site in Ohio is really tied into a continental exchange network. And this is not just the case with Mound City, but it seems to be the case with many, many archaeological pre-Columbian sites across North America. Probably the most important site in the Midwest and maybe in North America is the Cahokia site. Conservatively, probably 20,000. Some scholars estimate 50,000. Now, 20,000 is smaller than places like Tewksbury or Chelmsford today. But let's keep in mind that the city of London in 1200, roughly at the same time, was also only about 20,000 people. So pre-modern people, cities were significantly smaller because for every city dweller, you had to have a large farming population. For every person living in a city, you needed to have about 9 farmers supporting those people. And so we can make the same assumptions about North America, that with 20,000 people, Cahokia is really a major, not only North American, but really a major global population center. Interesting there too, I think I mentioned it before, but I'm turning kind of old and gray and sometimes memory. For example, the pole sites here too. That for the pole ceremonies, rituals that are found at this Mississippian site, but many others as well. There's evidence of ball sports here, which is exactly the same with several of the other sites we're talking about. I'm just checking on my watch, and I think I have about 10-15 minutes, so I'm trying to move things along. All right, so after kind of quickly exploring the so-called mound builders, or the Adena and Mississippian and Hopewell people, I want to look at the ancestral Pueblans as another interesting case study. And here again is sort of an archaeological reproduction of one of those ball courts that is being used. And they play an important role in many pre-colonial or pre-1500 indigenous societies. And these sports continue, of course, after colonization, but there's various reasons why indigenous societies shrink. So probably the most famous sites in the Southwest are Mesa Verde, which is, it's just gangbusters these days. Like the national park has been really advertising this site. And it's fascinating. Big settlements. It's an incredible site if you get a chance to visit. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico is also a fantastic site. It's harder to get in and out. And so you have to be really outdoorsy. I mean, yes, for the suburban Massachusetts person here, but it's these two sites are written largely about. I don't want to spend too much time because most people are quite well informed about it. Maybe we have time in discussion to explore it more if people are interested. But I want to talk about some of a little bit of the smaller sites that I find also quite fascinating. And so this is a site right outside of north of Flagstaff, Arizona. And on the left-hand side, again, you see one of those ball courts. If you step a little bit further down, you sort of have this hole in the ground and you're kind of like, why is this here? And then you actually lean onto it and you're like, wow, this is natural air conditioning that is coming out of this hole. And this is like out in the desert. So you're like in 100 degrees weather and you're just gulping down the water and it feels kind of nice. The other thing that's very fascinating, again, these are very much ruins, but if you walk in and you get into like some of these little bit reconstructed rooms that are still standing there, you actually get a sense of the cooling effects that this way of architecture has, and sort of the abode construction, or looking back at Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, the reason why they're built into the rock is really to take advantage of the cooling effects of the stone. And it's very much very fascinating. Another interesting site is Grand Bandelier Park, which is one of my favorite sites too, also in Arizona. Another fascinating site, and I'm just looking at the watch, having 7 more minutes, is Walnut Canyon. Again, this is even further to Flagstaff, and it's a fascinating site. It's kind of hard to explain what's going on here, and most archaeologists just kind of skip it because it doesn't fit certain patterns. But what you have here is basically this massive canyon, and you have to be in pretty good shape because, again, it's very hot, and then you have to use a lot of stairs to get out. But what you have in the middle section of this canyon is, on various sides of the canyon, is basically these built-in apartment buildings that are all over the middle level of the canyon. People must have, using lines and ladders, climbed down to get water. Several of these rooms here are also for water storage, and then had to climb up to practice agriculture. So it's an incredibly adapted way of life that, again, this is a part of the country that for many months doesn't see rain. So the incredible water management and sustainability strategic planning that must have gone on in these communities is just mind-boggling. And everything must have been done by climbing and using ropes. So it's an incredible, fascinating site, and I can't really do it justice. That it's like one of those places I only really understood. I mean, I read about it, but I really only understood when I walked there, looking up these incredibly looking up to the ledge of the canyon and looking down, and I'm scared of heights. So it's just like, wow, how these people did this and survived in this space for 100, 200 years and make it work is incredible, is an incredible sign of human achievement and ingenuity. Another interesting site in the Southwest that doesn't get much, or should get more traction than it does, is the Chimney Rock in Colorado. And again, it's a Puebloan ancestral rite. Here's sort of another thing that you see in a lot of the Puebloan sites is the kiva. So this is a site built on, and as you can see, you sort of from the picture here, you're up on a rock, like beautiful mountains around you. It's beautiful southern Colorado. And so what archaeologists assume is that the elites lived on top, and you had to carry water up, food supplies, and then the commoners that supported this community up there lived in the valley. And so they probably also had to carry the water up and also the food. And it's it's a challenging hike. And now we have roads and you can drive up there, but hiking up there with a load of water or food would be very time consuming, very strenuous. And you sort of get a sense of how the people up on that rock would be sort of really like the people in the medieval castle, be serviced by this community, but also sort of have a clear and separation from the commoners down at the ground. And what is also fascinating about the Chimney Rock, when you look at the two rocks there, this site tracks the major lunar standstill that happens every 18.6 years. And again, the archaeological understanding to like figure out this is here, and then putting up the resources to put the site up on top of the ridge and then support this, again, speaks to a high level of organization, scientific understanding, social organizing, and certain values in these societies that are quite fascinating and interesting. Anyway, so we have, of course, our stuff here: Mosley State Park, the earth formations, and then very the stoneworks, and so a lot of interesting history in New England. But I am running close to out of time, so I just want to kind of reiterate here again that the ancient North American world is really a world dominated by agricultural communities, urban landscapes, landscape management, and also long distance exchange networks. And we have kind of forgotten this very impressive and important history because of sort of the history of colonization that we have experienced as a country.
Christoph, I don't feel like you have to rush. If you go an
Oh,
extra
no.
minutes,
I think
we're
on 45. So I said 40 minutes. So we're good here. But I want to stop with this image to also remind us of two things. So the church here is on the Taos Pueblo, And this is actually a site where a very horrible massacre of the Taos Pueblo was committed by Americans in the mid-19th century. But that is part of the history. But also, when you look at the Taos Pueblo, it still speaks to the survival and the persistence of the Pueblos to this day. And I think this is a good stopping point. We're right at 45. I want to leave some time for questions, and I've droned on enough. So
folks, let's give Christoph a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. Christoph, you didn't drone on. You did a great job. So folks, if you have any questions, please get them into the Q&A. If you have any comments, please get those into the chat. And we'll address as many of them as we can within the next 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to go to the Q&A first. Let's see. So an attendee asks, have you read Gear and O'Neill's series that covers indigenous groups all across the US, mostly pre-Columbus?
No, I'm not familiar with the series. Sorry. As
Joan
I said
wants
at
to
the
know,
beginning of the conversation, I'm a teacher on this subject and don't claim any expertise.
Joan wants to know, can you give us your email address? I'd love to contact you about a bibliography I'm putting together.
Okay, yeah. You find me on the UMass Lowell website, Christoph underscore Strobel at uml.edu. Please be patient. I get a lot of email, and as department chair, I get an insane amount of email. So I will respond. It might just be, and make sure if you don't hear from me after a while, make sure that the email is correct.
And I know the fall semester is just about to start up.
Yeah, that
But
too.
I'll include Christoph's email address in the follow-up email I send tomorrow. Lillian asks, what happened to the people at Walnut Canyon and Chimney Rock?
That's a good question, and there is very many good theories out there. So some people say that maybe there was a scarcity at Walnut Canyon, scarcity of water, climate transitions. Other people say there might have been other outside pressures coming in on these groups. And so there is various theories trying to explain why these people disappeared towards the end of, not disappeared, but abandoned the site towards the end of the medieval period. All of them seem very convincing to me. But I also think they're all plausible. And it's likely maybe even a combination of several factors, that water scarcity, outside pressures, all happening at the same time leads to people moving to places that they perceive as more safe.
Linda asks, could you speak further on the earthworks at the Maudsley State Park and explain what the mound is in terms of size or function?
I don't. I mean, I've walked the site many times and I find it very fascinating. And I mean, it's also Massachusetts, so sort of the state archaeology board doesn't. I mean, they're still sort of in the mindset that like stoneworks are sort of all colonial constructs and that these are just natural formations. But it seems to me that there's more going on, and that we have sort of connections, that there is enough mound building activity here that seems to suggest that there's more going on, but it's a very understudied topic. I mean, as a as a historian that spends a lot of time on talking of the colonial history of New England and indigenous colonial relations, and has also done work on indigenous peoples in New England, I'm always like appalled when I talk to archaeologists and like, New England's the backwater. And I mean, that's the words they use. And I'm like, what do you mean? New England is like the principal place in America. I mean, this is where they're like New England snobism comes in. But archaeologists have neglected to study New England in any serious shape and form. And a lot of it has to do with our rough climate, acidic soil. So that the evidence that survives is very limited. But we also have to sort of a long, strong history of sort of denying this history and sort of saying our Native Americans just disappeared, and often kind of forgetting that history of colonization, and then sort of how our New English writers have really kind of help to propagate that myth and sort of in forgetting and sort of, and that's what I'm trying to wrap my brain around in my current work.
Stephen asks, could you comment on conflicts and wars between indigenous peoples?
Yeah, there's lots of them. Just like Europeans were fighting and killing each other, there's a lot in terms of indigenous people too. Resource pressure, male values, honor, and that kind of thing, things that are not so unfamiliar from any martial culture. They exist in certain indigenous cultures too, in some areas more so than others. Just like there was violent warfare in the European context, violence and warfare also exists in North America. So if he wants me to go into anything specific, but yeah, so that's kind of like a very, very vague answer, but yeah, I hope that helps.
Marion asks, what caused the demise of the Cahokia settlement?
Again, I'm not sighing because it's an excellent question, but it's just like with the Walnut Canyon site, there is a lot of theories out there on what happened there. Some people think it's environmental. Other people have proposed disease, right? Because of the coming of Europeans, and you have maybe as many as 50 to 90% of the population. With Cahokia, it seems the decline was earlier. There also seems to maybe climate results. Some people have suggested that there had been massive floods and re-irrigation of river that had then wiped away large parts of the populations. So these are just, I think, 5, 6 theories on top of my head. I am not a Cahokia expert. I've read tons of books on it. I visited the site. I think it's fascinating, but I think the verdict is still out there. And I think this is a lot. This is why I find this history so fascinating, because it really teaches us how little we actually know and how much cool stuff is out there. And even sort of the construction of these sites, there is stuff we just don't understand in our cultural framework. Sorry.
Yeah, so an anonymous attendee just wants to know the difference between the phrase pre-colonial and the phrase pre-Columbian.
Yeah, that's a very good question. They're all fraught. I mean, pre-Columbian, well, I mean, archaeologists often use the term prehistory, sort of before history. And I think there is history there, so I don't like using this term, but it's really sort of, the argument was prehistory archaeologists don't study writing, historians study writing. But then the problem is a lot of these prehistorical societies actually have writing. And so then that's that. So that is one category that's problematic. Pre-Columbian, of course, puts Columbus at the center. And so everything that happens before Columbus, sort of kind of, to some, it suggests that there's no history before Columbus. And so again, with the prehistory, the pre-colonial, just to me, is a term I use. I don't think it's perfect, but at least it seems to me, okay, there's a pre-colonial European history. This is not to suggest that there were indigenous people that were colonizing each other and things were happening in those areas potentially too. But I really feel like the coming of the Europeans to the Americas is an incredibly, it has a tremendous impact on indigenous societies in North America. And I sort of, like unmatched in history up to that point. This is why that's why I personally prefer the term pre-colonial, but all of these terms certainly work.
Donna asks, could you speak more on the Massachusetts and New England sites?
Yes, but that in itself would be another talk. And then I think there is other people that would be more qualified for that. I mean, it's fascinating. I want to wrap my brain around it more. I need to learn more about it. I've been to a couple of sites. But yes, I have not had enough time to study that. But there's certainly like the Maudsley State Park, the earthworks that you have a lot of in local communities. You have a lot of experts, some indigenous, some good caretakers. Those are great people to get in touch with. There's a couple of websites. People are often very protective of these sites because stoneworks are easily destroyed. And so be cognizant of that too. But so that's kind of like my minimalistic answer to that. Folks are out there. There's a retired professor at Bridgewater State, who wrote a book called Stone Prayers, which is very fascinating. I'm blanking on his name, and the book is in the Home Office. So that's a good starting point of a study if you're like interested in that. So hopefully that helps.
So let's see. Barry asks, did the early arrival of the Vikings in North America have much of an impact on the indigenous population?
It's hard to say. Um, um, on the evidence, it seems to suggest less so. Could there have been disease outbreaks connected to it that don't show up in the archaeological record? Absolutely. But in terms of like like compared to 1492, probably not. But there is definitely a Viking presence beyond the like early 3 settlement attempts, but then also probably in later years that Vikings come to this region to trade, to get timber, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then European fishermen might have likely been exploiting this region before Columbus as well. And that's another point of argument that persists amongst archaeologists and historians, but sort of like Basque fishermen, and then really all over the Atlantic coast, European fishermen might have exploited North Atlantic waters very close to the coast, and actually landing on the coast to like salt and fire dry the fish, et cetera, maybe before Columbus.
All right, so we're in the speed round here. Shane would like to know, is it known who built America's Stonehenge in Salem, New Hampshire?
That's another controversy that, that is it indigenous, is it not? There's a lot of interesting work on that, and I think I am the wrong person to talk on that. I find this is, again, a fascinating place. Is everything? Yeah. So some of it seems a little overdrawn, but some of it is quite is interesting as well. And we have a lot of other like sites in New England and stoneworks that are quite interesting.
Elizabeth and Gary note that Stone Prayers that you referenced is authored by Curtis Hoffman.
Thank you, Curtis Hoffman. Thank you.
Let's see here. So many great questions. I feel bad having to choose.
And I can stick around longer. So
well, okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I don't want to go too much longer, but we'll go into overtime a little bit. So DM asks, as a historian, can you comment on the value and place for oral history, its value and role in the narrative about pre-colonial America?
Yeah, I think it's important, and it plays as much of a value as like archaeological records. And sort of in my work, I often try to like use sort of the European sources, archaeology, and then the oral histories and indigenous informers, because they really are a wealth of information. Yeah, sort of like the Narragansett historian. I mean, his knowledge on stoneworks, and I think he lives out in Athol, Mass now. It's like it's incredible. The guy is just like these elders are like walking encyclopedias, so they know a lot of the stuff, and they have a very interesting perspective. And this might sound condescending, but let me say, I find their perspective as interesting as that of European sources and authors. And yeah, and I mean, when you read Europeans and you look at their description of indigenous peoples, there's clear biases and misunderstandings and cultural illiteracy that shapes their perspective. So you have to be critical of all your sources.
So to answer a question from Marianne and Richard, I'm not necessarily sure if Christoph will be back later this year. He'll be busy teaching, but I do know we do plan on having some more Native American history programs as part of Native American Heritage Month in November. We'll be partnering with a few other libraries for that as well. So stay tuned. I don't have the details yet, that there'll be more coming. So whether they're a direct follow-up to this webinar or not, there'll be more programs. So I'm going to jump to the chat because there's a bunch of questions in the chat as well. Elaine asks, what animals, if any, were domesticated during this time period?
So it's predominantly the dog in like places like New England. And then in the Southwest, there's also the turkeys. So the turkey we eat today, it's not the variety we have around here, but it's from the Spanish colony, so Mexico and the Southwest.
Barbara asks, what type of ball games were played during this time?
So like early forms of what we would call lacrosse. And then they have this game with this large ball that is being carried around. Then there's various other games. They're like New England native people, they had this ball game, and it must have been a field of like a mile and a half where you had like two sides, and it's often from not competing, but different villages that were trying to carry an object across. And you can imagine how both of these villages are just trying to fight themselves down and often advancing like little, like a couple of 100 yards, then it goes the other way, so that these games could go on for forever and really sort of like proving your manhood and also getting you essentially ready for combat and such things.
So Doug asks, is there a genetic relationship between Mesoamerican cultures like Mayans and other North American Indians? And then he also asks, what about between Southwest Indians and other North American groups?
Genetic, it's possible people meet each other, they have sex, right? Would it leave that big of a impact? It's hard to say. There seems to be a lot of overlap in terms of the objects that are being used, architectural styles, and archaeologists are really uncovering a lot of interesting stuff there that suggests that there is a lot more going on there than meets the eye. In terms of genetics, I'm not familiar with the scholarship on that issue, so I have to plead ignorance.
Scott asks, can you tell us more about the oven technology? What were they built out of?
The way I understand it, it's like a lot of local clays, depending where you're at, and sort of they're really kind of, when a Pueblan, they're kind of like these, look a lot like the pizza oven. I don't want to like make any like fake advertisement here, but like the flatbread places, when you look at the pizza oven, they kind of look like smaller versions of that. So with a fire probably in the middle, and then bread being baked on the sides. Yeah, so and there seems to be a lot of commonalities between those types and also stuff that is being used in the Midwest on the limited evidence that we have.
Nicole asks, in your experience, have archaeologists gotten better at consulting local tribal communities before taking what they consider artifacts, or trying to match their theories with the oral history of the people who originated from the land?
Yeah, I think that is the case. And I don't know if this in part, I think in part it's archaeologists being more and more aware of that history that they have. And I also think it's just federal regulations. It's very hard to sort of the like hit and run places, like get your artifacts, drag them away. It's just the federal law is very clear. NAGPRA and other like federal laws that have been written remains patriation. I mean, there is a lot more work that needs to happen in this area, if you ask me. At the same time, it's gotten a lot better, and there's more of an effort to be respectful and to include Indigenous people in the perspective and work. And there's, as in history now, there's a lot of Indigenous archaeologists and a growing number of historians too, and I think that helps quite dramatically.
April asks, now that we know more about DNA and do more with it, do we know where the indigenous people first came from before North America?
Yeah. And I think the sort of the judgment on DNA, and there's people that are more knowledgeable on this topic than I am. But you can sort of like trace lineage, but I also think there is limitations in that. So I think it's one tool in the box. I'm always sort of reluctant to leave if that's your only toolbox you're using. I think there's limitations to that. I kind of like to sort of see more connections, but when you go back in the ancient past, it is really sort of difficult to say. But then I also think that it can give you certain indicators, but it's also not the answer to it all.
Linda asks, have you ever visited or studied the Acomac Pueblo in New Mexico?
I have not been to that particular site, unfortunately, but
no worries. And
maybe
I do apologize for any mispronunciations. I tried to practice, but I don't know what's coming up with these questions. You never know. Let's see.
It's a fascinating site because there's a big, if I think I understood it right, the Acoma, there's like there's a really nasty massacre there by the Spanish there. And when they took, it's like up on the hill. I mean, I've always wanted to go there. I just haven't had the chance. It's a very brutal history. Yeah.
An anonymous attendee, in museums, do you know how archaeologists know which families to credit for artifacts?
I think often they don't. I mean, and this is sort of like when you go to archaeological museums today, a lot of the work that they do, and it might be interesting to sort of invite someone from the Peabody in Andover. Marla, their curator, or their archaeologists, very knowledgeable people. So they would be much more knowledgeable on this. But they spend a lot of their time like looking at their artifacts and then trying to track them to the right people and bring them back to the communities.
So we'll end it with this one, Christoph. This is a little bit more about yourself. Barbara wants to know, have you ever interviewed Indigenous people for any of your books? And Lynette would like to know, aside from studying Indigenous history, do you have any professional or personal friendships with Indigenous people?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is how I kind of got into this racket. I had a friend who was Seneca in college, and so this is kind of going to the reservation with her. That's how I kind of got my start. It depends. So I kind of look at myself more as a historian of colonial indigenous relations and sort of colonization. And my personal feeling is the reason why I don't, there's times I interview people when it makes scholarly sense, but the kind of community approach, if you study a community, I think it is instrumental that you talk to the indigenous people from that community. But I also believe that, especially in New England, you have indigenous people that are doing this work already, so they don't need another white guy coming in there telling their story. They can tell and should tell their own story, and I don't need to be part of that process. So that's kind of like trying to, maybe a little bit of a blunt answer there, but that's kind of my sentiment on that. I hope that makes sense.
And I promise we won't have too many white guys in November when we do our Native American Heritage series.
Yeah.
So Christoph, any last words for the audience before we wrap it up?
No, thank you so much for coming out there. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. I think Robert's going to send out my email, but you can also just Google search history department at UMass Lowell, and you'll see my ugly face right there, and there, my email information will be there too. And thank you so much for coming out. And I hope everyone has a good evening. Take care.
Yeah, so for those watching live, look for an email tomorrow with the recording, with Christoph's email. And when you exit the Zoom in a few moments, just make sure to take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey. Let us know what you thought of today's program and what you'd like to see for future programs. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again, Christoph.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
You too.